Welcome everybody to migrate to the vCenter server appliance. You should. Typical disclaimer that you've seen yesterday, today, and throughout the week, so I'm sure by now you probably have it memorized. So here's the agenda. We're going to do a quick intro. Then we're going to talk about migration overview, talking about the migration tool itself. William is going to cover automation. Then we're going to talk about alternative migration paths. So if you're in a situation, we're gonna explain how to get out of it, like horizontal migration. And then we're gonna, hopefully enough time that we can cover questions. So quick intro, my name is Ahmad Yunus. I'm a senior technical marketing engineer at VMware. I cover the vCenter server appliance, vCenter server migrations going from Windows to the appliance, and VMware Cloud on AWS.
Thanks. My name is William Lam. I'm a staff architect working within our integrated systems business unit at VMware. I work really closely with our engineering teams, and I kind of try to provide the voice for our customers. I run a personal blog on virtuallyghetto.com, and you can also find me on Twitter and reach out that way as well.
By the way, before we get started, we do have the product manager in the room. So if you have any pieces of feedback, he is sitting right here.
Say hello. His name is Abhijit, available 7 days a week.
His social security number, no, I'm just playing. All right, so let's have an overview of the actual migration tool that's available today. So, I don't know if you guys are aware, but on Friday, we announced deprecation of Windows vCenter Server. I recommend going out to the blog. Here's the short URL, but basically, going forward, as we've been talking about for the last year, the VCSA is VMware's direction for vCenter.
How many of you guys today are still running Windows vCenter Server? Show of hands, please. Whoa.
Wow.
You guys got the memo, right? Now, who's going to be migrating to the VCSA? There we go. Okay, that sounds good.
So everybody get your laptops out, and we're going to go through this now. All right, so here's the overview. The migration tool has two components. The first component is what's called the migration assistant. And what the migration assistant does is goes out and does a scan of your environment and comes back and gives you some key pieces of information. Things like what's installed, what's registered in regards to plugin, the size of your environment, things like that. It also serves as the conduit that copies the data from the source Windows vCenter server to the appliance. And like I said, it copies the data. It makes no changes, okay? Then you have the actual migration tool, which you run from a machine on a routable network to your vCenter server. And if it's an external, then same thing for your PSC or in case of 5.5 SSO. And you're gonna go through a two-stage process. Stage one deploys the brand new appliance. Stage two configures the appliance and then layers on top the data that we copied over from the source Windows vCenter to the appliance. Now the beauty of the migration tool is we keep the identity of vCenter, meaning we keep IP address, FQDN, certificates, UUID, MOREFs, anything regarding the identity of vCenter, we bring it over. And that's key because UUID is how solutions talk to vCenter. So as far as any solution is concerned after you've migrated, it's the same old vCenter server. In regards to migration path, if you're currently on vSphere 5.5, who here is still on 5.5? Okay. So if you're on 5.5, update all the way up to update 3E and you want to get to 6.0, then you're going to use the 6.0 update U2M. If you're on 5.5 all the way to 3E, then you're going to use 6.0 update 3. Now keep in mind, if you go to 6.0 update 3 and you want to get to 6.5, you're going to have to use the 6.5 update 1 ISO. All the migration tool is included with the exception of 6.0 update U2M, which is a separate tool. The others, the migration tool is included with the VCSA ISO. So let's jump into automation.
So I'll quickly cover some of the automation capabilities of the vCenter Server appliance. We've actually had this since 6.0. So we not only the ISO, you get the binaries of the vCenter Server appliance, but inside of it, there's also some tooling that we provide for automation purposes. This is a CLI utility, and again, as I mentioned, this came in with 6.0. So when you extract the ISO, see if I can get the mouse clicker going, you'll get this directory called VCSA CLI installer. So this is a CLI utility that allows you to automate the entire lifecycle management of your vCenter Server appliance. So that's going from install, upgrade, as well as migration. And then within this directory, there's a nice little directory called templates. And then we actually break that out organizationally based on install, upgrade, and migrate. So based on the scenario you want, we then include templates for all the different variations of install, upgrade, and migrate. So whether you're upgrading a platform services controller, if you're migrating from a Windows to vCenter Server appliance, we actually have pre-canned templates that have some information filled out there. And here's a screenshot of what that template kind of looks like, right? So pretty easy to read. And the really nice thing about this is that you can actually source control this, right? So for installation, you can put this in your revision control. And if you have to redeploy and or upgrade or use these as cloning templates, you can easily add some variables in here and make changes to this. And as I mentioned earlier, the CLI utility itself is what drives this migration tool. And here's a screenshot. I did this on my Mac, but this utility is actually multi-platform. So this works on Windows, Mac, as well as Linux. And this is the ability for you to automatically, completely automate the entire lifecycle process without having to perform any manual task. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and really going to be focusing on the meat of the presentation. Imad quickly gave you an overview of how the migration tool works, and we spoke to a lot of customers that have had success going through the utilities of all various sizes and environments. But there are going to be some customers that are going to be in certain scenarios where they will not be able to take advantage of the VMware's official migration tool. And we want to provide you a path forward to the appliance. As we mentioned earlier, we are deprecating Windows that got announced last week. And we know that customers are looking for paths forwards, and we don't want you to have to manually go through that process. And so we're going to go through some scenarios that we've seen while talking to a large number of customers and provide you with some solutions and some guidance and some considerations based on some of these scenarios and all that. And we'll ask some questions to kind of get some feedback based on what types of environments you guys are seeing, and that kind of helps us move the presentation along based on some of those scenarios that you guys might be interested in. So the first scenario that we're going to be covering is something that we're kind of referring to as horizontal migration. The official VCSA migration tool today does sort of two things. It performs a migration changing from a Windows-based platform over to the vCenter Server appliance. And then after that, we actually also perform an upgrade. So if you're going from a 5.5 environment to a 6.0, we're not only changing the Windows to appliance platform, but we're also performing an upgrade. And so this is the reason that the utility cannot support a horizontal migration where if I'm going from a Windows 6.0 environment and I want to go to a 6.0 VCSA, or if I want to go from a Windows 6.5 environment over to the VCS 6.5.
So by a show of hands, who here is in a situation where they need to do horizontal migration? Okay.
Maybe a dozen or so hands. Okay.
Not too many. Okay.
The next scenario that we're going to cover is a consolidation use case. Here I might be starting out with multiple vCenter servers. They can be deployed in different topologies, but the idea is that you may have multiple vCenter servers that have been provisioned, and you actually want to consolidate the number of VCs down to perhaps one. And today that's not currently possible in the utility, and the reason for that is that the migration utility has a one-to-one relationship when you do the migration. So I can migrate the first vCenter server and I'll get a new VCSA, but obviously I can't automatically associate these other vCenters with the appliance.
So again, who here is in this situation? Oh, okay, not that many.
And then lastly, the third scenario that we're going to be covering is around topology changes. This is the vCenter server deployment topology. So an example here is I want to go from an external deployment where I have my PSC running as an external system, and now I want to consolidate that and change it from an external PSC to now an embedded VCSA. The other option could be also going from an embedded VCSA and splitting that out to an external PSC. And again, we don't support topology changes. There is options for that. One option is to reconfigure based on the version of vSphere you're running. So if you're in 5.5, there's a little bit more flexibility, and you can change your topology, right? So if I'm running in an external deployment, I can reconfigure myself to be an embedded, and then I can perform the migration. Or I can go through the migration process and then reconfigure myself after the fact. Obviously, there are some considerations and some constraints. A lot of that's actually documented, as well as some of the blogs that Imad had written about.
Yeah, so if you were in my last session with Adam Eckerly, we kind of talked about embedded, external, all that. So we did have a question in regards to, hey, I'm external, I want to get back to embedded, and we talked about that. So, and we'll cover that here in a little bit. But who here is in a situation where they are external and they need to come back into embedded? Okay. All right. So it's kind of, same across the board between horizontal, topology change, and consolidation.
Okay.
So,
are there any other scenarios that we're missing up here? Just shout.
Exact opposite we said before. We're actually embedded Windows to external.
well,
Okay, so basically a topology change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I think there was a hand over there somewhere. Similar.
From external to external.
External to external. Okay. So kind of like a horizontal. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other ones?
I'll migrate to a brand new, just go from Windows to a brand new virtual center.
Okay. In all three of these scenarios, you're deploying a brand new VCSA.
Yeah, remember, because we're going to the appliance, right? Windows is deprecated, so bye-bye.
You got one hand back there? Yep, we'll have some details around that.
Yep.
So the question was, can we do a side-by-side type of a migration? So basically, both vCenters might be up and running. There's a variety of scenarios and use cases that you might want to have that particular configuration, and we'll be also covering that as well too. So thank you for all the feedback. Okay.
Yep.
I'll take the next one.
All right, so now that we've talked about these alternative types of migrations, let's talk about the considerations. So as William and I were talking about this session, we wanted to kind of make this easy for you guys. So what we came up with is this framework. Now again, this is our framework of what we believe, a migration should cover. So we have vCenter Server as one component. We have ESXI hosts. We have vCenter Solutions, anything basically talking to vCenter Server. And then we have the virtual machines. So kind of looks like Simon Says, doesn't it? So me and William are going to kind of play a little game, right? Where he's going to be the VMware representative and I'm the customer. And we're going to go through the framework and give you an idea of how to get out of some of the scenarios that you're in today. So the first component we're going to talk about is vCenter Server. So William, I have two environments, right? The first one is less complex, and the second one is a little bit more complex, right? I have multiple vCenter servers, and what I want to do is I want to get my tags, I want to get my cluster configurations, things like that. I want to export them out, so when I deploy a new vCenter server, I'm able to copy them over. And I'm a little concerned, especially when it comes to things like tags, because I want to make sure that they all come over nice and clean. And is it better for me to do this manually so I can ensure that, or should I script this?
All right. It's a great question. You should always script it. But it really depends on your environment. Sort of if you have small environments where you're not interested in all the data, it's not like you're really just interested in tags and you don't really care about the other configuration. You might have had some cruft left behind in the old Windows vCenter server. Maybe the database is really giant and you only want a subset of information. You can obviously automate it. I highly recommend it. But if you have one or two environments, it might necessitate for you to do it manually by hand. So you may want to export some of that information out there and then copy that to your vCenter server. And obviously it's still up and running, and so you can have a one-for-one comparison to see if you have any information that's missing. Now for larger environments or much more complex environments, the recommendation is really to automate and script some of that information, and we'll provide you some guidance there. And the idea here is that any of the settings that you care about in the vCenter server, you're going to want to basically get that information either documented manually or have some reporting utilities that basically capture that information. So things like tags, permissions, roles. This is where there's a little bit of risk route when you're going down this manual route, is to be aware of all these configurations. Some of this might be rollback access control for how customers or your tenants are consuming the infrastructure. So getting this information out in a correct manner and importing that back in is really critical. Now, there are ways to simplify some of that too, right? So if you're going from a horizontal migration and you start out with an external PSC, and you want to stay in that same deployment topology, you can then deploy the VCSA with an external PSC, and you can actually use it and join it back to the original Windows vCenter SSO domain. And the benefit there is that you then have configured an enhanced linked mode temporarily. And one of the benefits of enhanced linked mode is that you're automatically replicating things like tags, permissions, license, and other information, right? So you can actually leverage ELM in a slightly different mechanism to help you with your migration, if that's all you care about. And once all that information has been replicated, so you can log into your new vCenter server appliance, verify that things like tags and permissions have been replicated over, then you can actually then sever the connection. So there's a way to basically decommission that enhanced linked mode, because we know we're going to get rid of the Windows vCenter server, but we're really using enhanced linked mode as a mechanism to automatically replicate a subset of metadata information that you really care about. Right? So that's one option that you can actually take.
Okay, that's good. But you know, when I was a Windows admin, I named my Windows vCenter server based off the operating system. So it's WinVC01, right? So I have that scenario, and now I'm deploying a VCSA. I really don't want to be tied to this name. And then in the other environment, we're actually going to a different network. I'm okay with the name, but I want to change the IP address.
Right.
Any recommendations there?
Yeah, we got a couple options. So how many of you guys are in that boat today where your host name is really tied to the platform or maybe to the version of the piece of application? Okay, about a third of you guys. There's a couple of options actually. So for the changing of the appliance, because we're spinning up a completely brand new VCSA, you have the opportunity to pick a completely different host name with a completely different IP address, right? The IP address can live within the same subnet. If you don't have additional network infrastructure for that network, you're going to obviously provision a completely brand new one. So in the host name change, that one's actually a pretty straightforward one. You're deploying a brand new VCSA. You can then use linVC if you wanted to. In the scenario where you say, I want to keep the FQDN, because that's the one that I've given to my customers, that's the one that everybody's logged into, I really don't want to change it. But I need to change to a completely different network. We know today that once you've deployed a vCenter server application, you cannot change the IP address. So in the scenario where you're wanting to keep the host name, but you want to change the networking, what you're going to have to do is going to be, going back to sort of the first point, is exporting out all the information that you care about the system, so things like tags, roles, and permissions. Then you're going to actually have to shut down the system, right? Because you're going to want to reuse that host name, right? So then you have to shut down your source Windows vCenter server, deploy your brand new VCSA using that exact same hosting they used prior. And in that scenario, you can use DNS to change the IP address to something completely different.
Okay, okay, sounds good. But I'm a little worried. I was reading some blogs.
Don't
and
blogs.
Oh, okay. All right. I won't read your blog. I mean, so, you know, out there I see things about this vCenter server identifier. And I'm a little concerned that since I already have, you know, several vCenter servers already, I'm going to deploy a new one. You know, what are the chances that I'm going to get the same identifier that could potentially cause some MAC address conflicts within my, you know, workload, my VMs?
Right. So this vCenter has this ID, automatically gets generated. You have 64 different values. I was talking to one of our performance engineers, you know, there's some math behind it apparently. And he's like, the risk of you running into a conflict is like getting struck by lightning 3 times in a row or something like that. But in all seriousness, you know, there is that chance, right? If I have this identifier, vCenter basically uses ID and a bunch of other information and uses that to generate unique MAC addresses for your virtual machines. And obviously you don't want to have conflicts. We have seen some customers run into this, and this is really a high churn CI/CD pipeline where they're provisioning anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 VMs per day. And in that scenario, you're really going through quite a bit. Or customers who have a lot of different vCenter server environments. You know, we're talking 10, 20 different vCenter servers. And at some point, you're going to exhaust those numbers, right? And there is a chance that you will get a conflict. Now, the good news is that we have a lot of built-in protection mechanisms right into vCenter server. The first one is that we have automatic MAC address collision detection as a vCenter alarm. That's enabled by default. And so if it detects that there's a VM with a duplicate MAC, you do get an alarm for that. So obviously, you can have it send an email to you. Do an SNMP trap, or you can take some further remediation. The second one is actually sort of good hygiene that you can actually do today in your environment, which is writing some scripts that goes through and looks through all of your VMs across your different vCenter servers and see if there are any potential duplicate MAC addresses. In certain cases, you might expect it, right? If you're running behind a fenced network or vCloud Director network, where that might be expected. But there may be scenarios where a rogue admin might have deployed a VM, manually change the MAC address without telling somebody, and you might have seen some network connectivity issues. Generally, people know there's going to be an issue or not, but in case you don't, there are ways of using, you know, Power CLI and other APIs to basically query all the different VMs, extract their MAC addresses, and check to see, do you have any duplicates? You can also go through your vCenter server and check what the ID is, whether you're using the UI or using the API. So hopefully that kind of helped with some of your concerns.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So vCenter is good. So let's talk about the hosts.
So before we jump there, let's take a look at some of the solutions on the page.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So as I mentioned earlier, here are some of the options that you can take. There's this nice little blog post here by some individuals. So the good news is there's a lot of content out there in the community. Myself, Alan Renouf, Luke D, all of these guys have so much content on there for like reporting, remediation purposes, recreating it. So these are just really a sample of some of the content that's out there. Some of this is actually specifically for migrating between different vCenter servers, as well as between Windows and the appliance. And the idea is that there's a lot of tooling out there that you can take advantage of. So for this first one, it actually is a nice little script that will basically export some set of configuration, things like roles and permissions, and then re-import that into another vCenter server. And this actually does it side by side. So there's no expectation that the source vCenter server needs to be down. They both can be up and running. You can even use this as a way to basically replicate configurations. Like you don't need to go through a migration, right? So this is really independent of the migration itself, but can be very helpful. The second one was backup and restore of vCenter tags. Again, leveraging automation APIs, I can actually back up all the tags as a backup mechanism for tags in general, but you can also use this mechanism to basically re-import tags into a brand new vCenter server, especially ones that you're deploying fresh. There's this new project that actually recently came out from Eero Sanchez called vDocumentation. It's actually a really neat little project. It's a bunch of Power CLI modules that produces really nice reports of your VMware infrastructure. So this can be another thing to kind of help you document what you have. And so if you're trying to do this manually, at least you have a documentation that describes what your configurations are, and you have a way to go in back, applying those settings, and then you can run the script again on your new VCSA and kind of compare the output, right? So you can kind of do a little bit of manual work, a little bit of documentation, and this just helps you identify some of the gaps that you might have. And obviously this is also great for documentation purposes as well. And then the last one is RV Tools, another great little utility. This is a UI-based application, so if you're not into running scripts, using Power CLI, and you'd rather have kind of like a GUI-based application, this is also another really useful application that's completely free by the community, and you can even export it out as a spreadsheet or anything like that.
Now the hosts.
There we go.
All right, so that's great and all, but here's the deal. I have some things going on in my environment, and I need some recommendation in regards to, should I, use the existing hosts and just bring them over, or should I buy new hosts and start off that way?
Right. It's a great question. I mean, a lot of times, we want to try to reuse what we have, but if you think about your infrastructure today, and if you're running 5.5 and you're running 6.0, how old is that hardware that it's been running for? Right? It's probably 3 or 4 years old, right, Imad?
Probably.
Right. And so you can keep some of that hardware if you cannot purpose new hardware for that, right? Obviously you're stuck into constraint, but there are some consideration is that think about the operational overhead of some of that hardware. Is it coming end of life? Does it make sense to start on a brand new platform with all these capabilities and kind of bring potentially legacy hardware across where you have to think about that? So there's some cost associated with that. But obviously there are going to be some customers where like I need to move that host around and leave the existing ones. And we also have options for that too as well. Some things to think about is if I want to basically swing across the host, do I want to disconnect? So there's a lot of some things that we can kind of go through depending on your scenario. So what are you thinking?
Okay, so what I'm thinking is I have a project where I need to go ahead and deploy new workloads, but at the same time I want to minimize and have the flexibility that if I can bring my old workload, the hosts over with those workloads, and then take my time to bring those workloads from the old hosts to the new hosts. Right. Is that possible?
Yeah, so it sounds like you want to provision some new hosts and start some capacity for brand new workloads immediately and start benefiting from the new CPUs and all these capabilities. Yep. And you want to move the old host over and then slowly move your workloads onto these new hosts and kind of decommission, because obviously you may not want to do it all in one downtime window. Is that kind of what you're thinking about? Yeah,
and I want to, I'm pretty cautious, right? Yep. I got this new environment. I don't want to bring all my workloads over, and then if something happens, I want the capability to be able to move them back, figure out what's going on, and then move them.
Yeah, so for that scenario, provision your new VCSA, add some new hosts so there's some capacity to it. You can then swing your host across. You can actually disconnect the host, so there's some metadata that's kind of left behind with your vCenter server for a backup plan, right? But obviously you want to swing that over, and then setting up EVC mode is actually a good recommendation there. That way that you can easily vMotion within those clusters, and you guarantee that the VMs can be live migrated. Now, there may be cases where the VMs don't need to be, and so those could be powered off and done as a cold migration.
Okay, so for EVC, should I set it based off my old hosts or my new hosts?
So definitely on the old host, right? Because the EVC really creates a flatline baseline for the VMs instead of capabilities. And so if I have some old CPUs and some new CPUs, your baseline is going to be the old CPUs and all that.
Got it. Okay. Let's talk about the networking piece. So, I want to make sure that the VMs, as they're coming across, they're running hot, right? But I'm using a distributed switch. Is it possible for me to go ahead and bring them over that way? Or do I need to make some changes before I start this migration?
That's a great question. We actually get that quite a bit a lot of times too. So who here is using a standard switch today for all of their networking? Okay, about half the room. So bringing that over is really straightforward. You just disconnect the host, recreate the standard switches, and you're good to go. If you're doing a VDS, there's sort of two options. Anybody doing LACP today? Okay, a couple of hands. So in the LACP case, you won't be able to take advantage. So I'll talk about the non-LACP case if you're doing a distributed virtual switch. One option is to basically disconnect from your source vCenter server, recreate the VDS on the new VCSA, and you can either do that by hand or you can do that via some automation. Swing the host across, right? So at that point, your VMs are still running. There's no downtime of your virtual machines, and you reconnect your ESXi host and rejoin the vCenter server. This works very well even in a vSAN-based environment. However, if you are doing LACP, that particular scenario will not work, and you're going to have to take the approach of taking your VDS, converting it back to a standard switch, rejoining that on the opposite end. There are going to be some issues if you try to basically swing and potentially have some downtime. So if you are doing LACP, that's something to be aware of.
Do you have any recommendations around, especially around the hosts, right? Can I automate this, or should I just do it manually? Because again, I'm conservative, and I want to bring maybe one host at a time to make sure everything comes over and everything's good. Or should I just automate the whole thing and let it ride?
Press the big red button. You want to hit the next slide? Yeah, no, so there's definitely a lot of options. Again, you can do this manually. The VDS Wizard, the team has really done a good job in terms of helping with automation, and you can even specify one host and say, hey, I want to apply this to all of the hosts. So simplified of the wizard is definitely available there. But I personally don't like to click a lot in the Flash web client. I don't want to get carpal tunnel syndrome. So you can actually automate that. So I've actually written two scripts at the very bottom here where I can automate going from a standard switch to a VDS, and then from a VDS back to a standard switch. And the script is very straightforward because you just basically add the number of hosts that you want to move. And so back to your conservative point, I can just start with one host. So I can just pass in one host and say, go through the migration. I'll go from VDS to a standard switch. Once that looks good, my VMs are still running, I can ping them. Then you can say, okay, now I'll run the from standard switch back to the VDS on the new vCenter server. So that's also available. Some other tools around host provisioning, right? If I'm doing things like auto deploy host profile, where I already have the ability to capture the configuration of my ESXi host. I don't need to worry about manually capturing what information on my old host and copying that to my new ESXi host, right? I can benefit from auto deploy and even host profile, where I can export that configuration and re-import that host profile into my new system. So then I can use similar set of settings and apply that to my new infrastructure that you're provisioning. Again, there's many different scripts out there as well for automating host configuration, things like vSwitch, NTP. So I really highly recommend folks to go take a look at what's out there in the community. 9 out of 10 times, somebody has already written it. It's probably by Luke or Alan. And so you can definitely take advantage of that and help you guys automate that. And then using things like vDocumentation or vCheck as a way to validate that, did you capture all the information, right? So if I ran vCheck against my source environment, I make those changes, I can rerun that on my destination environment and say, hey, are these the same? And if things are missing, you can go back and pull that information out there.
Okay. So now I have other things that are talking to my vCenter server. And I want to make sure that at the end of the day, we talked about the migration tool and the UUID. When I use the migration tool itself, since the identity comes over, any solution talking to vCenter, same old vCenter server. But in these cases, we're not preserving the UUID. So it is a different vCenter server. So I want to talk about, what should I do when I have things like, let's say, Update Manager, right? SRM, my backup solution, my third-party backup solution that I'm using. Any considerations there to make sure that, because I'm now switching from, you know, my Windows vCenter over to the appliance, and I'm swinging all this information over, are they just going to work, or?
No, unfortunately, there's no black magic here, right? As Ahmad mentioned earlier, we are deploying a brand new vCenter server appliance. And most of our third-party solutions will have, you know, references, unique identifiers for that vCenter server. So once I've moved to a completely different vCenter server, your VMs and all that, that association and the plugins just no longer work. And so in most cases, you're most likely going to have to reinstall those plugins or reconfigure those plugins. It really depends on the solution. So I'll give you an example for like NSX. I can reconfigure and say, here's my new vCenter server. Obviously, you need to still go in and, you know, potentially redeploy edges and controllers and all that kind of configurations. But for products like SRM, it is going to be a brand new installation, right? And because you are doing a new vCenter server. So definitely keep that in mind. And it was a great topic that you brought up, is around backups. Making sure that you've set up your backups and it's associated with a correct vCenter server.
Okay. So do we have anything that will help me kind of determine what's all registered with my vCenter server? I mean, I don't want to sit here and manually click around in my environment.
All right. I'm glad you asked. So there are some options here. The first option is, again, using automation and our APIs. We actually have a nice set of interfaces that allow you to query vCenter server and tell you what plugins and solutions you've got deployed. So things like SRM, VUM, any of our third backup parties, Veeam, Convo, any of those solutions talk to vCenter server will basically create a registration endpoint into VC. And so you can use this little script that I've created that will actually dump all the information out there. And so if you're not sure if you've got some solutions running on vCenter server, this is a great way of getting that information. Another nice little option is you can actually leverage the VCSA migration assistant here, not to help you migrate, but it is kind of like a pre-check tool that you can run on your source Windows vCenter server. And one of the pre-checks it does is actually look at the different solutions that's installed on VC or associated with vCenter server. So in this scenario, I can actually use the migration assistant in a very different mechanism and help me migrate and give me information about the environment. And it's literally using this exact same API. It's just whether or not you want to use a Power CLI script or if you just want to download a binary that VMware provides and run against your environment. And it's only doing a read-only operation, so there are no changes happening within your infrastructure.
Cool. All right. So at the end of the day, what really matters are my workloads, right? If I can't bring them over, this migration is pointless, right? So let's talk about, you know, new versus existing, workloads. So should I go ahead and bring them over, you know, hot, or should I go ahead and create new ones? I mean, what are the recommendations when it comes to migrating these workloads from source to destination?
So it really depends, again, based on your SLAs with your customers, your downtime window, level of risk, and potential rollback and all that. It sounds like your infrastructure may have some VMs that may not be that critical, so maybe some traditional dev test VMs. Those are some great candidates to basically guinea pig those guys out to the new VCSA, right, before you move on to more mission critical applications. And there's a couple of solutions here. The first option is obviously if I have shared storage between my old and new infrastructure, that becomes a very simple unregistration of the VMs from my source to my destination. Obviously, there's going to be some downtime there. I have to basically shut down the virtual machine, unregister from the host that it's currently residing on, and re-register that on the new host. Because I've shared storage, I'm not really moving any data across, right? So it is going to be some scheduling downtime, and obviously that's going to take a little bit of time, and it's more of a scheduling effort than anything else. So that's one option. Another option that we've seen customers use is kind of like a dedicated swing load. I may not have shared infrastructure. Like I said, you might be provisioning a completely brand new infrastructure. Maybe you're doing vSAN for that example. Customers have leveraged things like NFS as like a shared volume. Again, there's still downtime, but the idea is that I can mount the volume, move my VMs across using storage vMotion, right? And then unmount that and remount that to the other host. So that can help with data replication. But again, there's still downtime, which means that you still need to kind of think about that as part of scheduling. The next one is actually a really interesting one. It's a capability that a lot of customers actually aren't aware of. So how many of you guys have used vMotion before? There you go. And how many of you guys have done cross vCenter vMotions? Okay, decent amount of you guys. What's been the requirement for that? The enhanced linked mode, common SSO domain? It's wrong. So in our UI, to be able to do a cross vCenter vMotion, it is absolutely right that we do have to have an enhanced link mode because the capability is being driven out of the UI. Now the nice thing about this feature is that it's actually not bounded by the SSO domain. In fact, it has nothing to do with the SSO domain. you can actually perform a cross vCenter vMotion between two completely different vCenter servers residing on two completely different SSO domains. And this can all be initiated using the APIs. And in fact, whether you're doing it from the UI or API, it's the same mechanism. And this is a really neat feature that a lot of customers have been taking advantage of. In fact, I was speaking to a customer today, leverage the script that I've written, migrate 1,000 VMs. I was talking to another customer, 6,000 VMs. And so customers are leveraging this capability to do data center migrations. Moving off of Windows to Appliance, or even from Appliance to Appliance, I can do consolidation. So it's a really neat capability. And the nice thing about this is that I can live migrate the virtual machine. So obviously you're going to have network connectivity, right? The virtual network, either it's a VXLAN wire or some type of an overlay network to ensure that VMs are still responding on the application layer. But this can be done live while it's moving. You also have the option to perform this migration through a cold migrate. So rather than having to export the VM, copy that to the destination and re-import the VM, I can just perform a cold migrate, and it's one API call and you're done. Right, so there's some nice simplicity with this particular mechanism. And this can be used outside of sort of the migration scenario that we've been talking about. You also have the standard approach of, as I mentioned earlier, you can do export, import, exporting the VMs out as an OVF. Again, there's downtime associated with that, but that's always a mechanism. You can copy that to a hard drive and then ship that off to the site if it's residing in a different area. The last one is actually an interesting one. This is, again, another capability that was introduced in 6.0, similar to the cross vCenter vMotion capability. Is I can actually create a content library, and this is checking in all my templates, so all the VMs that I want to move out, and I create a publisher library. On the VCSA, I can then subscribe to that library, and content library by itself has a built-in replication mechanism that goes over standard 443 traffic. And so rather than having to export all the VMs, dealing with swing LUNs and dealing with shared storage, I can actually leave it to vCenter and have it automatically do this replication for you. And you can sync the content all at once. You can actually sync on demand. So you might say, hey, I have 4 terabytes worth of content. There are certain VMs I want to get over there much more quicker. So I want to sync that content first. And on the other content, I can sync that at a later point. So we can actually leverage content library as a way for me to move my workloads from my Windows vCenter server over to my vCenter server appliance. So you definitely have a lot of different options when you talk about the workloads. And it all depends, again, going back to your SLAs and just thinking about what is the expectation of the application, right? If you have some dev test VMs and you want to reduce the amount of time that you're copying, power them off, code migrate them across. For hotter workloads and all that, you may consider the cross vCenter vMotion capability, so that the VM is constantly running during this period of time, and it also reduces the scheduling conflicts that you may have to talk to your application admins and all that.
So what you're telling me is, with cross vCenter vMotion, I actually have some flexibility there, and if I'm in a topology that let's say for example, that the one that we showed earlier, where I am external and I want to come back to embedded, you're saying I can deploy an embedded vCenter server, and now use this, whether it's same domain, right? I can use either the UI if it's on the same SSO domain, or if it's a different SSO domain, right? Because in the case of, I have to isolate this or whatever, I can use the APIs and bring over thousands of VMs with a blink of an eye?
Yep, exactly. There's no considerations on the underlying topology. The only requirement is having to be on vSphere 6.0 because that is when we introduced the capability. And the most recent version of Power CLI actually has cross vCenter vMotion built into the move VM commandlet. So now you have an out-of-the-box commandlet that will do some basic functionality. There's a lot more capabilities that the feature implements, so that's kind of the script that I've written that makes it a lot more flexible for the different types of vMotions that you want to perform. And so again, there's 2 different options. You can use the official commandlet or you can use the script that I have, but the idea is that you have the ability to hot migrate VMs without worrying about how you've configured your vCenter server, how the SSO domains are set up.
This is pretty cool, but you keep talking about scripts and things like that, especially out in the community. Should I just download these scripts and run them in my environment, or should I make changes, or
Absolutely.
I mean, what advice do you have there?
Just run it right away. No. Regardless if you're using our official tool, scripts that you found from my site or anybody else, right? Bottom line is there's no substitution. Test, test, test. Try to build as closely resembling of an environment that you have for your production and really go through that test, right? Part of that allows you to go through the workflow set up timing and understanding what that downtime window might look like, what the recovery mechanism. But again, there is no substitution. I can tell you that it works, but ultimately you're going to be the person that's responsible for your organization. And so ultimately, I don't believe that you guys want to take that risk. And so highly recommend testing.
Cool. So, we kind of gave you some examples of, alternative migration types, right? And we talked about horizontal migration, we talked about consolidation, and we talked about topology changes. So we thought, what would be better than showing you a live demo, okay, of migrating horizontally and at the same time doing a consolidation. So William's about to demonstrate how we can go from a Windows vCenter server 6.5 to a VCSA 6.5 horizontally while changing out our topology, going from external to embedded.
So here I'm logged into two vCenter servers. The first tab is a Windows-based vCenter server. I will show you that it is configured with an external PSC. So as we can see here, where there's two nodes, there is a PSC-01, and then we have a vCenter 60-1. So this is running a 6.5 vCenter server, but the host name is actually 6.0. On the destination here, you can see that I have a vCenter 6.5 environment deployed, and this is running an embedded VCSA. So I'm going from a Windows 6.5 external platform services controller over to a vCenter server appliance that's embedded. So now I'm changing the topology. And I have workloads that I want to migrate across, some of which need to be running, some of which do not need to be running. And I have a bunch of information that I want to capture. So things like tags, DRS rules, right? Affinity rules that it might create, folder structures, and we want to carry that information over. So you can see this is a brand new host, so I'll show you that there is nothing configured on the VMs themselves. There are no VMs, no folders, right? Pretty blank slate. Now if I log back into my source environment, we can see that we have some VMs running. So a couple of finance VMs, obviously important. If I click into one of these VMs here, we will see that they have some associated tags here. So we have some things like application owner, asset tags, some system owner information for each of these VMs. If I click over to the VM folders, I got some nice folder structure here of where are my VMs, and I want to preserve that because obviously I have some permissions and RBAC based on that configuration. And if we go back to the cluster, I will show you that we also have some DRS rules that we've applied here. So here we have a couple of rules that we want to preserve, and then we also have some DRS cluster rules that we've created. So we have quite a bit of complex thing, and I really don't want to do this by hand.
Yeah.
How do we do this, right? So what I've done is written a little script here. Let me get this. Can you guys see this okay? Yeah? Yeah, cool. All right. So what I've done is I've written a bunch of functions here, and what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through each one. So here, what we're going to do is first going to connect to our source Windows vCenter server. So this is a 6.0-1, as I mentioned earlier.
I have your password now.
Oh.
I'm going to move some things later.
As long as it's moving off of the Windows server. Okay, so now I'm connected, and to prove to you that I am connected to that environment and I'm not doing any kind of magic weirdness, here you can see the VMs that I've just listed. All right, so you can see there's my marketing app, vApps, and VMs and all that. So the first one is I want to export my DRS rules. And again, a lot of this stuff is basing off of the default Power CLI commandlets and just showing you that just with a little bit of tweaking of the existing commandlets, we can actually export this information and do this in an offline fashion. The benefit here is that if I have an environment where I can have both vCenter servers up and running, this allows me to actually export all the configuration. I can see the information, right? Allows me to shut down the source, and then I can rebuild my new VCSA. I can also do this simultaneously and connect to my old and the new and do a direct export, but that gives you a little bit of flexibility that you don't need to have both up and running for scenarios where you can actually have both up and running. So we have this nice little commandlet called DRS rules. So if I just run, oops. DRS rules, cluster, Windows, shoot, what did I name it? Windows cluster, that's right. here it's going to list me all these DRS rules, right? And you can kind of see these are, tells me whether these are affinity or anti-affinity rules, and then on the right-hand side we see these VM IDs. These VM IDs are basically the unique identifier of the VMs. So doing a little bit of scripting, I can actually take this, translate them to the human readable name, and actually export that configuration. So what I've written is a nice little function called export DRS rules. If I can type this out. Oops. Oh, whoops. 1 second. Here I'm just loading all the functions so they actually show up. Oops. Now if I give the same cluster again, you can see here now I've just outputted the rules that we've just shown, and rather than the internal IDs of the VMs, I've actually now outputted the actual VM names themselves. Now if I run this function here with no parameters, I'm just going to output to the screen, but if I give it a path, such as the one that I'm currently in right now, it's now actually going to export the rules out into a little file called DRS rules. You can see here, it's a JSON-based file. Now I can take this and actually re-import that into my destination.
And now I have a backup copy of my config
That's right.
as well, so that way if something does happen, I can go reference it.
Now I also have another function for doing a DRS cluster rules. So I'll do the same thing. Now I've exported that out, and if we just take a look at the DRS cluster groups, you can see here these are the DRS cluster groups for my VMs that I've associated. Let's see. So next up, we will take a look at things like tags. So I want to export my tags, and there's a couple of options. There are my tags themselves, there's the tag categories, and then there's the tag associations of my tags and the virtual machine. So in this particular function, it's actually going to perform all three. I'm going to export my tags in the infrastructure, all my tag categories, and then all the associations. So if I just run export tags, queries a source vCenter server, you'll see that it's going to start gathering some of this information, and output that to the screen. So you can see here, here's some associations. So here's a VM called Engineering App 01, and we can see that these are the specific tags that's associated with it. And again, if I do a dash path and give that same directory, you can see now I've outputted a file called all tags category, all tags, and then all tag associations in that exact same directory. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about is exporting the VM folder constructs. So I run that, and now I can see the mappings of my VM folders. This is actually leveraging some code that Luke's written. All right, some customers may have some really complex nested structures and all that, and so he's written some nice functions that allow you to easily grab that information, and then I can then take that and export it in such a way that I can then reread that back in. So we'll go ahead and do this one part, exporting that out. Okay, so now that we have all our information, at this point I may or may not need my source vCenter server, right? In a scenario that we discussed earlier, I have some VMs I want to live migrate, and I have some VMs I may not need to have them up and running and stuff. So we're going to leverage the cross vCenter vMotion script. And what I've done there is I've actually, let me disconnect from this environment real quick. I've modified my script a little bit, where now I'm able to take in a list of virtual machines, and it's actually going to just perform a migration, and then they just get queued up. And if you want it into an ordered list of priority, you can put that in, and then the script will go and execute. So here we're just going to quickly look at it. All I'm doing is I'm connecting to my source vCenter server here, as you can see, and I'm also making a connection to my destination VCSA. And then I'm going to do a get VM, which will retrieve all the virtual machines from my source vCenter server. You can see that I'm using that source vcon connection. And then I have a little wrapper function called start cross move, and what that does is it takes in a list of the virtual machines I've retrieved, migrate them from my source vCenter server over to my destination, and then it goes in and disconnects. So I'll kick this off real quick, and then so here it's going to say I'm starting to initiate the vMotion. 6.0 web client or 6.5 old web client doesn't have the refresh mechanism, but. So now we've started to live migrate virtual machines, right? So our finance VMs are up and running. This is actually a Photon-based VM, so we can actually see it live on the other end. And then I have some other virtual machines that I'm wanting to migrate across. And so again, you can leverage the script to migrate n number of virtual machines. This is on GitHub. There's been a lot of contributions and additions to the capability, so I highly recommend taking a look if you weren't familiar with this capability. And again, you need to have at least vCenter 6.0 or newer to use this capability, so it's a great mechanism to consider upgrading.
So I have a question for you. With this mechanism, can I go back? You said from 6.0 to 6.5. Can I, if I needed to bring a VM back?
Oh, that's a good point. So we can do forward migration. Obviously, from a vCenter standpoint, we can't go backwards. So I can go from 6.0 to 6.5. If I do need to go backward, you do have a mechanism, but you're going to have to basically export the VM and re-import the VM. You can't do this live migrate. If it's 6.0 to 6.0, I can move them back and forth. If they're 6.5, I can also move them back and forth.
And I can leverage content library as well.
And you can leverage content, exactly.
Okay.
So here we can see the VMs have pretty much migrated over, and we can see the finance VM is finishing up. Right, so finishing up. So we actually don't need to wait for the VMs to get completed to start our import process. So at this point, we've done the migration. The VMs will be finishing up shortly. And we're now going to move on to the part where I'm going to connect to my new VCSA, and I'm going to take all that content that I had here, which is these JSON-based files, and now I'm going to re-import that information back into the infrastructure. So let's connect to our new VCSA. Let's go ahead and import our DRS cluster rules. So let me switch this guy over here. So now you can see that there's, I think I might have clicked. I actually accidentally ran this. Oh. Apparently I did not clean up last time when I ran this demo. Whoops.
All right, while he's doing that, you kind of see the differences between using the actual migration tool, right? Simplified does all the heavy lifting for you, but if you are in one of these situations, especially, as I talk to customers, William talks to customers, we have a lot of them that say, look, I want to change topologies. Well, you can't do it using the migration tool, but at least we give you a way using Cross vCenter vMotion to do so. So does this help you guys get from Windows to the appliance, or are there still other, blockers that are preventing you from getting to the appliance?
So we're putting up, so new data center, new hosts, going from AMD to Intel. What's the gotchas or the flags we can watch migrating from AMD to Intel?
So again, your different CPU types, right? So my recommendation, if you're going to do that, you're going from Intel to new AMD boxes, different procs. So you can't use EVC, of course. So my recommendation would probably be either, if you can, use the migration tool and let it do its thing, because there's no other requirement. That would be the simplest way.
So just really quickly, on the screen here, it's going ahead and building the roles, and so we'll go ahead and finish the rest of these guys. So if we do tagging, so you can see this, we're re-importing that infrastructure now. So now if I click over to our tags, we can see the tags are being imported in there. All the categories have been imported in there. And then I will run the folder. And then lastly, we're going to re-import the folder. And then earlier, I also imported the DRS rule clusters as well. So here we're creating the 4 directory structures. I'm now creating that association. So if we jump back over here, we can see the VMs are slowly getting migrated into their appropriate directories and all that. So again, with just a little bit of automation and leveraging a lot of this content from the community, you can completely automate the entire process. Right? You can do it very painfully, manually, or you can do it very easily via automation. Your choice.
All right, that's cool. Hopefully this was helpful. We kind of want to give you We kind of want to give you a little glimpse into some things that we are potentially working on. Don't ask for dates.
Yeah, so the first one earlier I mentioned that we do have automation capabilities for the entire lifecycle management of the VCSA. We can install, upgrade, and migrate. But the key here is it's CLI automation only. All right, so though you get automation, it's not as friendly. And so something I personally been involved in is around improving our API surface for our different products, and Lifecycle Management vCenter is one of them. So we are working on providing a nice RESTful API, similar to what you've seen today in the current REST API for vCenter, and have the full coverage of install, upgrade, and migrate programmatically via the APIs. Anybody interested in that? Yep, there you go, some hands. Great.
Along those lines, remember the disclaimer at the beginning. Today with the migration tool, we give you the ability to bring over by default the configuration and inventory, and then select historical and performance data if you choose. What winds up happening is this is all done with downtime, right? You have to wait until all this information is imported before you can use the VCSA. So what we're potentially thinking about doing is giving you a new option of bringing over the configuration and inventory right away, and you'll be able to use the vCenter Server appliance while the historical and performance data is being imported in the background. Is this something that you guys would like?
See some hands? Yeah. Awesome.
Okay, cool.
And we're still providing choice, right? So this is just another option for customers who want to be able to reduce the downtime when they perform an upgrade and say, I need to start provisioning. I don't need my historical data, right? So obviously you won't be able to query for that information because it's still being processed into the system, but you can continue using provisioning. And so if you don't need historical information, this is a great way to reduce the overall downtime. For customers who do have a reliance on that information, say, hey, I want the whole thing to be completed, I don't want it to be running while I'm improving my workloads, you still have the option to basically opt in for the current behavior, which is everything needs to get processed over before vCenter is now available. So the options will still be there for customers.
Again, potentially working on. Also, we wanted to provide you some resources. So I've written a bunch of blog posts out on the vSphere blog, of course, William's blog, my personal blog. We have a GitHub resource that William had provided, and me and him went in and consolidated a bunch of resources around migration. We kind of call it, I guess that would be the Bible for migration. We also have, for hands-on labs, there is a simulator that you can use. I've created a product walkthrough that is click-by-click, step-by-step for migration. And then we also have some lightboard videos that I've created around how to go from 5.5 or 6.0 and in the migration process itself.
And post VMworld, we're going to take all this content and the scripts that I publish will be published on a GitHub repository, and we'll continue making updates as new capabilities are available. And so this is kind of one place where you can go to, get all the documentation, get all the KBs. There's a bunch of content we haven't covered. There's some KBs out there that show you how to estimate the amount of downtime, and I've actually written some scripts against those KBs so that you can query your system without having to take any downtime and provide you with an estimated amount of effort that you might have to go through that process. So there's a lot of content, and we're trying to make it very easy for our customers to migrate across.
Yeah, and in the future we'll be writing blog posts kind of around some of these scenarios and going a little bit deeper. Another resource that's not up here is we just created a site called vSphere Central, and that's where we're consolidating a lot of the information for customers, so that way they don't have to go to various places to find all the information. So now we're going to open up to questions.
Yeah, and before we jump into questions, we'll also be publishing this as well. So before we jump into the slide, we just ask if you can fill out the survey. Let us know what you like, what you didn't like, what would you like to see more of next year. It helps us improve it for next year's VMworld.
For sure.
If you have any questions, feel free to stand up on these podium just so that everybody can hear.